Okay, so in the last example, I told you about how to do the sampling process from when you already have the whole population. So I told you that a good strategy is to use the command in Excel where it randomize 1 or 0, and then you can get a sample of 50%. But what happens if it's the opposite? If you already have a sample, but you want to check if your sample actually represents the population. And I will say this is in most of the cases what happens in reality, that you have already the sample, but then you want to demonstrate or to check if your sample represents the population. So the easiest way to do that is with the sample size, because if for example there are 1,000, I'm just making up numbers, 1,000 professional football players in Sweden. I'm continuing with example from the last video. And you already have access to a sample of 500 professional players in Sweden. That sounds good. That sounds positive. You have access to half of them. So in terms of the size, it sounds promising. It means that the other thing that you need to demonstrate is that it's not that it doesn't exclude one part of the population that we're going to talk about later, but it's good that from 1,000 you already have access, or you have the data of half of them. That's really good. So let's focus first on sample size, and then I go back to show to the strategies to show why that sample is random from the population. So when you think about the size of the sample that you want to study, you need to talk a little bit about the size of that sample. And students sometimes ask us teachers that, what is the best sample size? How many observations should I have? So the answer is that there is not like a unique answer, like I can tell you this is a number, because it depends on a lot of things, especially the size of the population. Because if the sample, I don't know where it is, I think it's somewhere in there, but if the population, here it is, it depends heavily on the population size. If your population is 5 million, for example, or 5 billion, like the world population, 6 billion, then that's a huge population. Your sample should be also somewhat huge. But if your population is not that large, then you have some flexibility. I'm going to check. I want to show you something later. So always try to make your sample as biggest as possible, or largest as possible. But there is kind of like some pros and cons. Like if the sample is too small, you can get incorrect results. But also if the sample is too large, it can be difficult to get it. Like maybe it can be a huge challenge, or sometimes you can even have like fake observations. That's something that you should be careful about. There is kind of a rule that some people talk about. If you read a book on statistics or in econometrics, they will say like I don't know why this exact number, but 380 is like the golden number. Like from 180, you have enough observations to that your sample is big enough for almost everything. But you need to be careful on this, like not really on everything. It's a good number, 380 is okay, but you need to be very careful. And in the end, remember that you also need to justify why that size. So it's not only that you assume that the reader knows everything, you also need to justify that. Like I mentioned before, when you choose your population, you also need to be ready to justify, or you should justify it in your thesis. So here is kind of the same thing. You should also be able to justify the size of the sampling that the sample that you're using. And this is all about sample size, but what about the other important thing? Like imagine that you have 500, the observations or data of 500 players and the whole population is 1,000. That sounds great. 500 players out of 1,000, that's a good number. But you also need to show, and this is part of justifying, that these 500 are also randomly selected, or that they came from a random sampling method. Because if imagine that 500 are only men, so in that sense if for your study it's important that you have men and women, then it doesn't work because you are excluding women. So be careful on that. Or for example, imagine that in that sample of 500 players, you only have players from the south of Sweden and you don't have anyone from the north. That's also not ideal, or not even not ideal. That's kind of wrong, because you are violating, or you are not okay with the idea that the sample is a subset of the population. So that is something delicate, something important that you need to check. So two important things. First, the sample size. You need to demonstrate that your sample is big enough, but also you need to demonstrate that your sample actually represents the population. There are other statistical techniques that people use to kind of show that, but I think that the easiest way to do it, and maybe the most honest way to do it, is if in your research design, if you justify why you are using that sample and why that sample represents the population and why that sample is random and not biased selected, then you won't have any problem with that. And sometimes we dig too much on the statistical methods to try to show that maybe in the end we are missing the simple steps. So remember, make sure that you show that your sample is big enough, and then also make sure that you show that your sample is representing your population. And finally, justify that your population is right, that what you are studying is correct and coherent with the research question, with what you want to study. And again, it's always an iterative process. Like imagine that when I was discussing my research question, I said like, okay, I want to study the impact of salaries in football players. That's my question. Then I start thinking about the population. So if I don't narrow my question, the population is every football player in the world, every professional football player in the world, then I need to go back to my research question. Okay, so only only football players in Sweden. The impact of salaries in the performance of football players in Sweden, professional football players. And then, so I know my population, and I am okay if I include men and women. And then I go to the sample. Maybe I found a data set of football players from Sweden, but that data set is only for men. So then I need to reflect. Should I go and collect or find another data set that includes women, or should I reflect on my research question, and should I now narrow it even more to what is the effect of salaries in football players in Sweden that are male, only male? So maybe that can happen. That's the process in between question, population, and sampling. So in the end, it's very coherent. And then it also has some consequences, because if you change your research question, probably you will also have to change your literature review. You will also have to change your kind of research logic and the theoretical storyline, because imagine that gender was important. If gender is important, you can't take away gender, and then you need a sample that has women and men. But if you can't get that, if it is impossible, maybe for your thesis, it is easier to change the, go back even more than the research question, go back to the root of your research. And maybe it's a possibility, it's just practical things. Like, I think when we teach research methods, we teach it like it is a religion, like you need to follow blindly, but it's not like that. It's like it has practical things. If it doesn't work, you do something different. And finally, just to finish this video, I want to show you a table that kind of oversimplifies this idea. This is a quite old paper. The paper is already 52 years old, but that's what I said about the 380. The 380 is big enough, because here it says that if you have a population of 10, your sample size has to be 10. You can't exclude anyone. And it makes sense, I think. I think in this paper, they try to mathematically find the how relevant differences are depending on the size of population, and that's where this comes from. So you can use this as a guideline, but in the end, you should reflect on your own context of your own research, of your own population and sample. So it's a lot of reflection in here. So now I think we are done with the sample. Now let's move on to other important concepts.